I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth before I lose my mind.
The kitchen was quiet in a way that felt wrong, not peaceful, not calm, the kind of quiet that settles over a room right before something breaks. Julian Ashford stood at the counter with a single sheet of paper in his hand, and he slid it across the table toward his wife like it weighed more than paper had any right to weigh. Naomi looked down at it. He'd expected confusion. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head the entire drive home, picturing her eyebrows pulling together, her mouth opening to ask what any of it meant. That's not what happened. Naomi went still. Not confused, still. The kind of still that comes from someone who has spent years bracing for a moment they always knew was coming. And now that it had finally arrived, there was nothing left to brace against. Her hands folded in her lap. Her knuckles turned white, and Julian understood, in that one unbearable second, that his wife was not surprised. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly, "and I need you to tell me the truth before I lose my mind. Have you ever trusted someone completely, a spouse, a best friend, the person who knows every version of you, only to realize they'd been carrying something for years that could have changed your entire life, and they chose not to hand it to you? Have you ever looked at someone's face in a moment like that and realized they weren't lying to you out of cruelty, but out of fear? Stay with me until the end of this one, because the truth waiting at this table doesn't only belong to Julian and Naomi. It belongs to a young woman who has no idea yet that her entire life is about to change, and she isn't even in the room. If stories like this one pull you in the way they pull me in, hit subscribe now, because you're going to want to see exactly how far this goes. Right now, in that kitchen, Naomi Ashford is about to tell her husband a truth that will take their marriage apart, before it becomes something neither of them recognizes. 3 days earlier, that same kitchen had held a different kind of quiet. Julian Ashford was 48 years old, and by most measures, he had built exactly the life he'd once hoped for. He'd met Naomi at 29, married her the following year, and spent the 18 years since turning a rundown seaside property into the Gable House, the restaurant that now carried both their names on the awning outside and their entire adult lives on the inside. Their son Callum was 20 years old, away at college in Boston, calling home every Sunday out of habit more than necessity. Julian liked to think of his life in simple terms: one wife, one son, one restaurant, one story. He had never needed it to be more complicated than that. The package on the counter complicated it anyway. It had arrived weeks earlier, a birthday gift from Theo, his business partner at the restaurant, who thought it would be funny to trace Julian's ancestry after an entire dinner spent listening to Julian insist his family had old roots along the Maine coastline. Julian had laughed along with everyone else, spit into the little plastic tube on a lazy Sunday morning, sealed the envelope, and mailed it off without giving it another thought. It sat in the back of his mind exactly where a joke belongs. Forgotten. 6 weeks passed before an email arrived with a subject line that meant nothing to him. At first, "Your DNA results are ready." He almost deleted it. He was tired that evening, worn down from overseeing renovations on the guest house behind the restaurant, and a DNA report felt like the least important thing waiting in his inbox. But he opened it anyway, the way people always seem to open the exact thing that's about to change everything, right before they're ready for it. The ancestry breakdown was ordinary enough. Irish, English, a trace of Portuguese he hadn't expected. He nearly closed the laptop there, satisfied, already composing the joke he'd make to Theo the next morning. Then he noticed a section he'd missed the first time, a new feature the company had apparently just added, glowing in soft blue letters near the bottom of the page. DNA relatives. There was one match listed: Marlowe Hale. Estimated relationship, parent-child. Julian read it once, then again, then a third time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Marlowe wasn't a stranger to him. She was 22, worked at the local bookstore, and had spent the last 4 years as Naomi's closest friend, someone who showed up for Sunday dinners, who Naomi had grown protective of in a way Julian had always found sweet, almost like an older sister looking out for a younger one. But parent-child wasn't sisterhood. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't anything close to what Julian understood his life to contain. He had one child, Callum, sound asleep in a dorm room 3 hours north, completely unaware that his father was sitting frozen in front of a laptop, staring at a name that didn't belong anywhere near their family, and somehow already had a seat at their table every week. Julian sat there long enough that the kitchen light on its timer clicked off around him, leaving him in the dark with nothing but the glow of the screen and a single sentence he couldn't make smaller no matter how long he stared at it. Because if the results were right, he hadn't just uncovered a stranger's mistake. He'd uncovered a daughter he never knew existed, one who had been sitting across from him at dinner for 4 years, calling his wife her best friend the entire time. Julian didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his study long after Naomi had gone to bed, the laptop open in front of him, refreshing the results page again and again, as though the numbers might apologize and correct themselves. They never did. His mind kept dragging him backward to a version of his life he hadn't visited in over 2 decades. 22 years ago, he'd been 26 years old, unmarried, working construction jobs along the coast before the Gable House existed, before Naomi existed in his life at all. That summer, there had been a woman named Corinne Voss, quiet, sharp-witted, a seasonal worker who came for the season and left with it, the way seasonal workers always did. They'd had a few months together, nothing serious, nothing built to last past September. She left town, and Julian never heard from her again. He hadn't thought about her in years. Marlowe was 22. The math settled into his chest like something dropped into still water, sending its rings outward until they touched every part of his life he thought was solid. He didn't confront Naomi that first morning. He couldn't, not without knowing what he'd be confronting her with. So instead, under the excuse of resolving an old property boundary dispute, he drove to the county records office and asked for something else entirely. Any record of a woman named Corinne Voss, last known address in Millbridge, over 2 decades ago. What he found took the air out of him. Corinne Voss had died 16 years earlier. A car accident, according to an archived notice in the local paper. She'd been 30 years old, survived by one daughter, age 6. Julian sat in his truck in the records office parking lot, with the printed page shaking in his hands. For the first time since opening that email, he cried. Not quietly, but with the full weight of a man realizing all at once that he had a daughter he'd never met, a little girl who lost her mother at 6 years old and grew up without ever knowing her father existed, or that he might have wanted to know her. Have you ever discovered a truth so large it rewrote everything you thought you understood about your own life, not because someone lied to you outright, but because time and distance had simply buried it? That kind of grief doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, and then it doesn't leave. If this story is already pulling something out of you, hit subscribe now, because what Julian uncovers next is the part that changes everything. Grief, as sharp as it was, didn't stay in front for long. A colder question pushed its way through it. If Corinne died when Marlowe was 6, and Marlowe had only been part of Naomi's life for the last 4 years as an adult, where had she spent the years in between? Who had raised her? Who had shaped her into the young woman who now sat at Sunday dinners laughing at Naomi's jokes, treated almost like family already? And more than that, out of every town along the coast, every possible life she could have built, how had she ended up here, in this town, at this table, closest friends with the one woman who happened to be married to her father? It didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like something with a shape Julian couldn't yet see, and the only person who might be able to see it clearly was the one person he was suddenly afraid to ask. He brought the results home that night, folded into a single sheet of paper, and set it on the kitchen table in front of his wife. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to tell me the truth before I lose my mind." Naomi looked down at the page. He'd expected her face to fold into confusion, the way anyone's would at a stranger's name attached to an impossible relationship. Instead, she went still, the stillness of someone who had spent years quietly bracing for a moment she always suspected was coming. Her hands folded in her lap. Her knuckles went white. "You knew," Julian said quietly. "You knew Marlowe was mine." Naomi didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was low and careful, like she was choosing each word from somewhere it hurt to reach. "I didn't know for certain," she said. "Not at first, but I suspected. And once I let myself really look at her, the way she laughs, the shape of her eyes, I couldn't unknow it." "How long?" "Since the day I met her." Julian felt something give way beneath him, some floor of understanding he didn't know he'd been standing on. 4 years, he said. You've known for 4 years, and you let her sit at our table calling you her best friend instead of telling her she had a father right in front of her? It's not that simple, Julian. Then explain it to me, because right now, it feels exactly that simple. It feels like you found my daughter and decided to keep her a secret instead of giving her back to me. Something in Naomi's composure cracked at that phrase, given back. She was never yours to be given back, she said, her voice breaking. She was never anyone's to give. That's the whole point, Julian. That's what you don't understand yet. Have you ever heard someone say a sentence that sounded like a defense, but landed like a warning, like there was an entire history underneath it you hadn't even asked about yet? There was, and Naomi was about to tell him all of it. Stay with me for what comes next, because this isn't just the story of a secret anymore. It's the story of who Naomi was long before she ever became Julian's wife, and what she carried quietly for years before any of them ever met. The truth, when Naomi finally released it, came slow and painful, like a wound reopening after years of careful stitching. Before I ever met you, she said, I was a social worker. Fresh out of graduate school, 24 years old, barely trained for half of what that job actually asked of me. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, but her voice had steadied, as if she'd rehearsed this confession in her mind so many times that saying it out loud finally felt almost like relief. 16 years ago, I was assigned a case. A 6-year-old girl. Her mother had just died in a car accident. No father listed on the birth certificate. No next of kin willing to take her in. Julian sat very still. I was the one who processed her transfer into the foster system, Naomi continued. I sat with her in a cold intake office while she cried for a mother who wasn't coming back. She didn't understand yet that her whole life had just changed. I don't think I fully understood it either, not at 24. But I never forgot her, not once in all the years since. Marlo, Julian said quietly. Naomi nodded. I kept a photograph, just one, a school photo her mother had given the agency before she died. I don't even know why I held on to it. Caseworkers aren't supposed to keep things like that. But I packed it away in an old file box, and every so often, for years, I'd think about her, wonder if she'd found stability somewhere, wonder if anyone had loved her the way she deserved. And then she showed up at your library fundraiser. 4 years ago, Naomi said. She was working the book donation table, quiet, guarded, in a way that felt familiar before I even understood why. We started talking, and something about her pulled at me. I couldn't explain it, not at first. It wasn't until weeks into our friendship, when she mentioned almost in passing that her mother had died when she was 6 and she'd grown up moving between foster placements, that my stomach dropped. You recognized her. I went home that night and pulled the old case file out of storage. The photograph matched. The name matched. It was her, the little girl from that cold office, grown into this bright, careful young woman sitting across from me at book. Club, like fate, had circled back to finish something it started years earlier. Julian's jaw tightened. And you said nothing. I told myself I needed proof before I said anything that could shatter her world again, Naomi said. She'd already lost everything once, her mother, her stability, years bouncing through homes that were never really hers. I didn't know for certain the timeline, lined up with your summer in Millbridge. If I said something and I was wrong, I would have destroyed the one steady friendship she'd finally built, over a guess. So, you waited. I told myself I was protecting her until I had proof, Naomi said, her voice dropping to something raw. But if I'm honest with you, and with myself, I was protecting us too. Because the moment there was proof, I knew our family would never look the same again. Have you ever told yourself a small, reasonable lie for so long that it eventually became the thing standing between you and the person you loved most? He found her in the back room of the bookstore, surrounded by shelves of second-hand novels that suddenly felt like witnesses to something far too large for that small space. Marlo looked up when he walked in, smiling the easy, familiar smile she always gave him at Sunday dinners. That smile didn't survive the first 30 seconds. Julian, what's wrong? He sat down across from her, and for a moment, he couldn't find where to begin. So he simply began at the start, the DNA kit, the joke gift from Theo, the email he almost didn't open. There was a match, he said. Someone listed as a parent-child relationship. He slid a folded page toward her, the same way he'd slid one toward Naomi days earlier. "It was your name, Marlo." She stared at it. "I don't understand." 22 years ago, I knew a woman named Corinne Voss, Julian said quietly. One summer, before Naomi, before any of this, I didn't know she was pregnant when she left town. I didn't know anything until 3 days ago. Marlo's hands pressed flat against the table, like she needed something solid to hold on to. "My mother," she whispered. "I'm so sorry," Julian said. "I'm so sorry it took 22 years for me to know you existed." "And Naomi?" Marlo's voice sharpened. "Where does she fit into this?" Julian hesitated, then told her the rest. The intake office 16 years ago, the photograph Naomi had kept, the fundraiser, the slow recognition, the 4 years of silence that followed. Marlo went quiet for a long time. "My whole life," she finally said, "I used to lie awake wondering if my father even knew I existed. I imagined 100 versions of him, some cruel, some just too afraid to look for me, some who simply never cared enough to try." Her voice trembled, tears sliding down her face, quiet and furious all at once. "I never imagined the version where he was sitting across the table from me every single week, and the woman I trusted most in the world knew it, and said absolutely nothing. She was scared," Julian said, though the words felt like a betrayal of his own anger the moment he spoke them. "Scared of losing you, scared of being wrong." "She wasn't wrong, though," Marlo said. "She was right, and she still chose silence." She wiped her face, her voice hardening into something Julian hadn't heard from her before. "Do you understand what that means? It means the person who found me, who could have handed me back a father 16 years after I lost my mother, decided silence was safer. For 4 years, I sat at her table thinking I'd finally found somewhere I belonged, and the whole time, she was deciding how much of my own life I was even allowed to know. If you've ever had someone you trusted decide, quietly and without asking you, what truth you could handle, you already know exactly what Marlo is feeling in this moment, and it's about to get harder before it gets easier. Stay close, because Marlo isn't done. She's about to say all of this to Naomi's face. Marlo drove straight from the bookstore to the restaurant, and she didn't wait for the dinner rush to end or for Naomi to finish with a table. She walked into the kitchen where Naomi was plating a dish, and the look on her face made Naomi set the plate down without being asked. "Julian told me everything," Marlo said. Naomi's hands went still against the counter. "Marlo, don't." Marlo's voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than if she'd shouted. "You don't get to soften this for me right now." They stepped into the back hallway, away from the noise of the dinner service, and everything Marlo had been holding since that afternoon finally came pouring out. "You were the first adult who ever looked at me like I mattered," she said, her voice shaking. "In that cold office when I was 6, you held my hand and told me everything would be okay. I believed you. I've spent my whole life believing you, and now I don't even know what was real and what was just guilt wearing the face of friendship." "Every moment with you was real," Naomi said, her own voice breaking. "The friendship was never the lie, Marlo. My silence was the lie, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting that I ever let fear convince me those two things were the same." "You don't get to decide that for me anymore," Marlo said. "Not the truth, not my family, not who gets to know me and when and how much. You took that choice away from me the same way everyone else in my life already had. I trusted you not to be one more person who decided things about my life without asking me first." Naomi didn't defend herself. She didn't reach for an excuse, didn't ask for understanding, didn't try to explain her way into being forgiven. She simply stood there, hollowed out, understanding for the first time in 4 years that this moment didn't belong to her at all. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this," Marlo said finally, wiping her face. "I don't know how to sit across from you at dinner. I don't know how to trust anything you've ever told me. I need space, Naomi. I need space from all of it." She walked out through the back door of the restaurant that evening, and for 3 weeks, neither Julian nor Naomi heard a single word from her. Those 3 weeks tested the Ashford marriage in ways nearly 2 decades together never had. Julian moved through the house like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. He was angry, genuinely, deeply angry, at the years his wife had kept something this large hidden from him. But underneath the anger sat something more complicated, a strange, aching gratitude that Naomi's silence, tangled and flawed as it was, had somehow kept Marlo close enough that he'd eventually found her at all, If you told her the truth the moment you suspected, he asked one night, unable to let the question go, would I ever have met her? Naomi considered it with the kind of honesty that costs something to give. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe you would have, or maybe she would have run from it, the way she'd learned to run from anything unstable in her life. I told myself I was giving her time to trust me before the ground shifted beneath her again. She paused, her voice dropping. But somewhere along the way, giving her time became protecting my own fear of losing the family I'd built. I can't separate those two things anymore, Julian. I don't think I ever really could. It was the most honest thing she'd said since the truth came out. And strangely, it was also the answer that finally let Julian see his wife clearly again. Not as a woman who had betrayed him out of malice, but as a woman who had made an impossible choice under impossible circumstances, and then spent 4 years quietly suffocating under the weight of it. It didn't erase what she'd done. It didn't undo the years Marlowe had lost, or the version of their life that might have existed if the truth had come sooner. But for the first time since that DNA email had arrived, it made room for something other than anger to sit at the table between them. Marlowe came back on a gray afternoon in October, 3 weeks to the day since she'd walked out the back door of the restaurant. She didn't call ahead. She simply appeared at the kitchen table where Julian had first learned the truth, where Naomi had first gone still over a single sheet of paper, and she sat down like she'd been building the courage to do it for days. I don't know how to feel about either of you yet, she said, her hands folded in front of her the same careful way Naomi's had been weeks earlier. But I know I'm tired of losing people to secrets. My mother never told me who my father was. Marlowe looked at Naomi, knew, and stayed quiet anyway. I'm done being the person things happen to. I want to be the person who gets to decide. She turned to Julian next. I don't need you to be my father in some perfect way. I've survived 22 years without one, but I'd like the chance to actually know you, slowly, on my terms, without anyone else deciding for me what I'm ready for. Julian's throat tightened before he could answer. That's more than fair, he finally said. Honestly, it's more than I deserve, given how long it took me to find you in the first place. You didn't know, Marlowe said simply. She's the one who owes the real reckoning. Naomi didn't flinch from it. I know, she said, and I'll spend as long as it takes earning back whatever trust I broke. Not because I expect forgiveness, because you deserve someone who keeps trying, even when it's hard, even when I don't get to control how it ends. Have you ever watched someone take full ownership of something they could have easily excused away? No defense, no bargaining, just the truth, offered plainly, with no guarantee it would ever be enough. That's the moment this entire story has been building toward. If it's meant something to you so far, subscribe now, because what these 3 people build afterward is the part that stays with you long after the video ends. What came after wasn't a tidy ending. There was no bow tied around 4 years of silence, only the slow, uneven work of 3 people learning how to be in a room together again. Marlowe began seeing Julian on her own schedule. Coffee some weekends, an awkward dinner where they mostly discussed books instead of everything neither of them knew how to say yet. She kept her friendship with Naomi at arm's length for a long while, the wound too recent to pretend otherwise, though she never fully walked away either. Julian and Naomi went to counseling together for the better part of a year, working through not just what she'd hidden, but why she'd once believed hiding it was a form of protection. As for Marlowe, she eventually left the bookstore and enrolled in social work courses at the local college, drawn, she said, to understanding the very system that had once failed her, and then, in its own circling way, delivered her home. I used to think finding my father would fix everything, she told Julian one evening on the porch of the Gable house, watching the tide roll against the darkening shore. But it didn't fix anything. It just gave me somewhere new to stand while I figured out how to fix myself. Julian thought it might be the truest thing anyone had said to him through the entire ordeal. I don't forgive you, Marlowe told Naomi honestly, months later. But I understand you a little more than I did. Those aren't the same thing. Maybe someday they will be. That's enough, Naomi said, and meant it. I don't need you to forgive me on any timeline but your own. Marlowe wasn't ready to call Julian Dad. Naomi wasn't fully forgiven. But every Sunday, when the 3 of them sat at the same table again, there was something steadier there than before the truth came out. Not because the truth had healed everything, but because finally there was nothing left to hide. And sometimes that quiet, unglamorous honesty is the only kind of ending a story like this one could ever earn.